All right. I did it. I set up the chat correctly. I'm so pleased with myself for having done that correctly. Wonderful. All right, we'll give it just a minute here for a few more people to join, and then we will get started. Okay, and panelists, can you just give me a thumbs up that you can still see my shared screen? Yeah, okay, perfect. All right, so I think we will get started here. I'm so happy to have everybody here from all over Illinois. It's fun to have a really Illinois-specific event tonight, so we can dig into what's going on in our state. So I think I will go ahead and get us going here. So good evening, everybody. Thank you so much again for being here tonight. My name is Ann Brewster. I'm for one more month, the president of the board of the Reading League Illinois. We've got a really good evening planned for you, and I know people want to just get going. So I'm going to quickly introduce the partner organizations that are helping out with tonight's event, and I'll go over some nuts and bolts, and then we'll go ahead and dive in. So if you aren't already aware, there are really some phenomenal organizations around Illinois who are doing pretty outstanding work for literacy, and many of them are sponsors of tonight's event. So my own organization, the Reading League Illinois, we also have the Literacy Advocates of West Central Illinois, the Dyslexia Action Group of Naperville, the Illinois Early Literacy Coalition, Everyone Reading Illinois, and the Specific Learning Disabilities Support Project. And we have representatives from those organizations, both as panelists and also on the call tonight. Some of these organizations have been around for quite some time, like Tom Parton's organization, Everyone Reading Illinois. And then others have just launched in the last year or two, like the SLD Support Project. Thank you, Kellen. But all of these organizations just really share a commitment to high quality, evidence-aligned reading and writing instruction for all students in Illinois. We're working towards this goal in a variety of ways: PD, advocacy, teacher training, and so on. If we have any of those organizations, representatives from those on the call tonight, if you want to drop in the chat a little blurb about the organization and a link to find out more, you can go ahead and do that. But we'll also include information in the email with the recording that will be sent out to everyone who registered for tonight's event. So I just really encourage you to learn a little bit more about these organizations if you share our passion for literacy and justice for all. So we have a webinar format tonight. So that means that as audience members, your audio and video are disabled, but you can certainly feel free to put questions and comments in the Q&A. That will just be seen by panelists, or you can put it in the chat and everybody in the audience will see those. So please feel free to type your questions in either place. One of our Reading League Illinois board members, Lindy Davis, is on the call as well, and she's going to be monitoring the chat and Q&A and feeding those questions to the panelists, both during the discussion and then hopefully we'll have a little time at the end as well. So get those questions in there. We don't have any formal handouts tonight, but we will be sending out a recording of this to everybody who registered within about 48 hours. And so as the evening progresses, if people share resources and links, we'll collect those and include those also in that email that goes out. And then finally, just know that if you're interested in getting a certificate of attendance for CEs or PD hours, we'll post that link at the end of the webinar. So just hang in there till the end and we'll get that information to you. Quickly did want to mention a follow-up event to both the webinar that we did last month about the literacy plan and about our webinar tonight. So the Reading League Illinois, we host a monthly coffee chat series for our members. But this month only, we're actually opening it up to anybody who wants to attend. And we're going to be chatting next Saturday at 10 a.m. with Louise Dekovitz. And I have a feeling that a lot of people on this call know Louise. She is very deeply knowledgeable about literacy and about dyslexia advocacy. And she's involved with a lot of different efforts, both statewide and nationally. I don't actually think I've ever asked Louise a question that she didn't have an answer to. I don't want to stress her out or put too much pressure on her, but I really do encourage you to attend this chat if you have more questions about dyslexia and literacy in Illinois than we're able to get to tonight. And then Kellen, I think you are also going to be there fielding questions with Louise, is that right? Awesome. So the registration link is there, and we'll drop that in the chat as well. And we hope to see lots of you there next Saturday. Okay, so that's all of my nuts and bolts. So let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. So let me find the way that I do that. Hold on just a moment, please. All right, here we are. So I am going to go ahead and let our panelists actually introduce themselves tonight. It's pretty exciting to have such a wealth of knowledge and really breadth of experiences in our 5 panelists this evening. So I'm going to have all of you just very briefly introduce yourself and explain kind of your role with the Dyslexia Handbook, and then we'll start talking about the handbook itself. I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order just to make things interesting. So Melina, that means you get to go first. So if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about who you are and what role you played in the handbook so far.
I am Melina Thompson. I am a speech language pathologist at JW Ader, Rantoul City Schools. I am going to be talking about bidialectical students and dyslexia and working on that part of the handbook. I'm very excited.
Awesome, thank you. We're really glad you're here, Melina. Okay, continuing on reverse alphabetical order, Kim Tate, I think we're going to move to you. So can you tell us about yourself and what your work has been with the handbook, please?
Well, I'm Kim Tate. I'm an instructional coach at International Prep Academy in Champaign, Illinois. And so my work really via the, I focused on multilingual learners, and so brought some information, some research that I had acquired to that section of the handbook.
Perfect, beautiful, thanks. And Kim will be talking with us a little bit tonight about some of that research. Kellen Cyrock, you are next. Tell us about your background and your extensive role with the handbook.
So my name is Kellen Cyrock, and I am the reading content specialist for the Illinois SLD Support Project. Prior to that, my role primarily has been working with middle school students in literacy intervention. And I've had the honor to work with Melina at JW Ader. Long story short, Melina has taught me a lot, and she kind of introduced me into the work of dyslexia. So I'm so excited to have her expertise with the Dyslexia Handbook. And so we'll talk about it later, but our role at the SLD Support Project is really annually revising and updating the handbook, and I'm really excited to just get the expertise from stakeholders across the state.
Awesome, thank you, Kellen. Alrighty, let's see, Tom, I believe you are next in my system here. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your role with the handbook.
I'm Tom Parton, another SLP who retired from the schools after 34 years. I worked about 30 years in language and literacy, and the last 20 years of my school time was teaching high school students basic reading skills and developing their reading. That was one part, but developing their reading at the high school level. I'm currently the president of Everyone Reading Illinois, and the area of the handbook that I probably worked on specifically was related to support personnel and related service providers.
Awesome, thank you, Tom. So glad you're here. All right, and our last panelist is Janine Hansen. So Janine, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and how you've been involved with the handbook. Oh, Janine, you're muted. There we go.
Hi, I'm Janine. I bring the parent voice to this panel. So I've been with the Dyslexia Action Group of Naperville, which is a grassroots parent organization. It started in 2012, I think. I joined it in 2017 when my daughter was having a lot of trouble taking flight and reading. And since then, I've gotten very involved with not just running our organization, but advocating at the local and state and national level. Our organization, what it has done is we raise awareness solely around dyslexia through different events locally and kind of regionally. And then we advocate for families and students on the local and state and national level. And the biggest part that we do is we connect parents to those local resources. So if you're looking for local tutors, or maybe it's a conference to learn more about, dyslexia and ADHD, and then we also connect people to the tools that are featured in this handbook. So lots of literature. What book do I need to read? What movie do I need to watch? And one of our greatest events is co-sponsored, done with ERI, which is a dyslexia simulation. And it really creates a lot of empathy. And it's been a very powerful tool to have to connect with different school district leadership and make a really big impression to open those channels for discussion of when there's changes needed. So I'm so happy to be here and talk about the handbook tonight, because I wish they would have had this one 7 years ago when my daughter was not taking flight and reading. So thank you so much for making this. It will make a big difference in a lot of people's lives.
It will. And the big important piece of that is getting the word out about it. So I'm really excited to have all of you guys here tonight to help really get the word out about the handbook so that people are aware that it's there. Because, and I think, Tom, you might be able to speak to this when we talk about background in a second, it's actually been around for a little bit longer than people realize. And so let's kind of start talking about the handbook, and maybe we'll start a little bit with the history. I am going to take our conversation and divide it loosely into 3 parts tonight. A little bit about the background, why and how the handbook was initially written, and then how it was more recently significantly expanded and revised. And then we'll dig into the content of the handbook, and then a little bit about some next steps and what might be coming next. So let's start with why and how this handbook came to be. And Tom, I know you've been involved, I think you've been involved with at least 2 different versions now of the handbook. Is that correct?
Yes.
So could you give us just a brief history of this handbook, and also talk a little bit about why it was decided to be put into place in the first place? What kind of problems was it trying to solve, and how that first version came to be and how it was written?
Yes, I was on the original group, which included a number of stakeholders, ERI, some administrators, teachers, the reading instruction advisory group. They wouldn't put the word dyslexia in that title. So one of the first things that we did was put the definition of dyslexia, which was adopted into the special ed section of school code. We were able, through our work, it was a non-funded group that met in Springfield. We were able to get that definition into the general ed section, and we were developing a handbook at that time, with the purpose of providing support for parents and teachers, and resources. We had a list of programs, a list of screening costs, what those programs and curricula covered. We had to have a legislator extend the group. We weren't getting a lot of support for extending that group through ISB. We did get a slight extension, and we put together a list of programs, information and resources for parents, a list of research that was available to begin this work. But then it folded. The actual so we had those materials. The actual handbook was developed through Representative Keith Summers from the Peoria area, and it was probably the Peoria group that contacted him. In conversations that I had with him, he was able to get the handbook into legislation, and that was probably 2018. I'm not exactly sure of that date. He met some resistance, but in terms of the legislators, the parents and others that were interested in dyslexia created a massive amount of internet traffic or website traffic on ISB, higher than other areas, which included healthcare. So for that session, it was a hot topic. He's no longer a representative, but a lot of our materials were rolled into that first handbook. I was not part of that section of the handbook. I was part of the original drafting of that.
So that's actually two versions then that came about before our current version.
Yes.
If I'm understanding you correctly. Wow. Okay.
And my involvement was not as a board member of Everyone Reading. I was appointed through the Illinois Speech Language and Hearing Association as representative. So I was representing a speech language pathologist at that time.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you for that history. That's really interesting. I don't think very many people know that the handbook has actually in some form been around for quite that long.
About 9 years.
Yeah. Yeah,
and,
right.
Yeah, and it was posted, and it was probably not receiving much traffic at all. It was very awkward. I think it was the Google Doc or Excel. We had a hard time getting the word out.
Yeah. So clearly, there was a need for some expansion and for some revision, and then for just trying to get the word out, as you say, Tom, quite a bit more. So Kellen, the responsibility for that really fell to the SLD support project, right, on behalf of ISB. So tell us a little bit, and I know it was a lengthy process, but can you kind of tell us a little bit about the process of taking the handbook from where it was in 2018 to where it is now?
Yeah, so the Illinois SLD Support Project is a federally funded grant through the Illinois State Board of Education in partnership with Eastern Illinois University and Eastern Illinois Area of Special Education. And we have a group of amazing founders, and they wrote into the grant that one of our tasks or deliverables is to annually revise and update the ISB Dyslexia Handbook. And so that's kind of where we come in, is they had this document, which was a fabulous document, the original, the OG handbook, but we saw it as an opportunity to expand and revise and to kind of just make it a better resource and more, I guess, more applicable or more usable, teacher friendly. So teachers could really see it and say, oh, okay, here's how I can use it. But what's really cool is that with our project is we can annually revise it and update it. And so it's never going to be finished because, as everyone knows, research is continually evolving. And so we are able to go in and change things as we read new research or different possibilities. And so one thing that we're really excited about this year with the work group this year is to add even another chapter, but more not so much theory, but how does this look in practice? As in, what does this look like in the classroom? If you're a gen ed teacher, if you're a special education teacher, if you are a reading interventionist, what does this actually look like? How can I actually provide an intervention for these students? And so, I mean, I'll say this all the time tonight, but really, really cool because we're able to continually add and make it more user friendly for those who are actually providing that intervention within the classroom. And so again, really excited that we are able to, and it's part of my job, which is a dream, able to actually continually revise and add research and gather information from stakeholders across the state who are much more knowledgeable than myself in how we can best support students with dyslexia in Illinois.
That is really exciting. Yeah, I love that it's really a living document. It's not meant to be like, here it is, and we'll get back to it in 10 years. It's just continually, yeah. And we'll talk, hopefully at the end, we'll have a little bit of time where you can share a little bit more about that. I did want to mention that one thing I'm aware of is that there's a work group, right? That's kind of been gathered. And I think that group has even changed since from last year to this year. And then the SLD, so you guys are kind of gathering input and expertise, and then you guys actually are responsible for drafting the revisions and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So we can't do it by ourselves, obviously. Right. Like, we need information from the most knowledgeable people across the state. So I'm really excited because we've added Melina this year. Yeah. No big deal. She's amazing. And so adding, expertise in specific pockets of the handbook is Just it's so good. It's really, really exciting because like I said previously, knowledge is ever, research is ever evolving, and just gathering expertise across the state. Because as we know in Illinois, every single district is vastly different, from the most northern part of Illinois to the southernmost part of Illinois. And so getting really all of the stakeholders at the table to see, okay, these are the students we have in front of us, multilingual learners, bidialectal students, whoever it might be in front of us, and here's how we can best support these students in our classrooms.
That's awesome. Yeah. So we'll dive in just a second here to what's actually in the handbook. But before I move away from background, Melina and Kim and Janine, was there anything additional that you wanted to add about the history or the background of the handbook before we move into the actual contents? Okay. Janine, did you want to say? I saw you unmuted there for a second.
I just think that the progress that's been made over the last 7 years with this document is really huge. And there's just to hear people, educators saying, and now we're going to go into the schools and teach people how to provide intervention and the right kind of intervention and the training behind that. Like, what a blessing that is. And thank you to everyone who is here, who worked on it and who's worked on it for a long time, and extend that to other people, because it's about time. And this is just really, really good news. And I think that, they've done a great job of getting to that next point and actually servicing the kids. So yay.
Yeah, I agree. Bravo to everyone involved, and really bravo to parent groups like yours too, Janine, because I think that the advocacy that Tom was referencing is really a huge, the parent advocacy is a huge part of what has caused this handbook to exist at all, and then to get the kind of revisions that it's gotten. So, I think you should probably pat yourself on the back a little bit for that too.
The original legislation that went through only included the definition of dyslexia, but of course was a larger bill as that works. But Decoding Dyslexia, a group of parents were instrumental in getting that passed. So they're the very first thank you for getting that movement.
Yeah. Lindy, I don't know if there are any, I'm not actually keeping a good eye on the Q&A in the chat. Is there anything in there that I need to bring up? Okay, well, so we'll move into it, because there's a lot to cover. This handbook is like 200 pages or something like that. So we're not going to cover all of it tonight, but let's dive in. So I'm going to just kind of quickly summarize for folks who may not have had a chance to look at it too much yet. The handbook states in the kind of very introductory remarks, it states 3 main purposes. The first is to provide guidelines for teachers and families on how to identify signs of dyslexia. The second is to provide descriptions of educational strategies that have been shown to improve academic performance of students with dyslexia. And then the third purpose is to provide a description of resources and services available to students with dyslexia and their families. So identification, and then educational strategies, and then resources, basically. So the first goal, which is helping teachers and families identify signs of dyslexia, is covered kind of in a few different sections of the handbook. There's a really big section, chapters 2 and 3, that are on understanding dyslexia and understanding reading in general. Chapter 4 gets more into the nitty-gritty of how students with dyslexia are identified in Illinois school systems. And then chapter 5 offers support for caregivers who may be navigating the complexities of dyslexia identification for their children. So that's a lot to unpack. But let's start with what dyslexia is, and then move into how it should be identified according to the handbook. So Tom, I might pop this back over to you as our well, actually everybody's an expert on this, but anyway, I chose you. So how is dyslexia defined in the handbook? And then tell us a little bit about some of the characteristics and the prevalence and some of the impacts, and that's a lot, but tell us a little bit about how dyslexia is kind of defined here.
The law stated that ISB will develop a definition. So that was one of the first charges of that REAG group. We used the definition from the International Dyslexia Association. We weren't looking to other states at that time. And that definition had been revised a few years earlier. But it was also the definition that was used from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. So it sure, it doesn't cover everything, but it covers the essence of the issues related to those with dyslexia. And with the incidents, and that's been pretty consistent over time, around 20% of the population. Not that 20% need intensive intervention or remediation, about 5% of those that will require a lot of a structure and support. Deficits with the phonological processing, understanding the sound system, if you will, and then the ability to incorporate the orthographic level with that. It's a language processing disorder. It's not related to intelligence. At that time, MTSS was just being developed. So we were getting away from, education was getting away from the discrepancy formula for identification. That's another webinar in terms of the pros and cons of that. But point being, we went with a very standard and respected definition. So that is the what's currently in law as well as in the handbook.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about, I would like to just take a second to debunk some myths that I think are out there in the world about dyslexia, specifically when we talk about dyslexia and the overlap of dyslexia with multilingual learners, and then also the overlap of dyslexia with bidialectal speakers. So I might ask you, Kim, to speak to that first, because I know you've done a lot of work with multilingual learners and emergent bilinguals. Can you just clarify for our audience, does dyslexia exist in all languages, or do you only have dyslexia if you're an English only speaker? In other words, can you be both dyslexic and multilingual? And just kind of share with us a little bit about that.
Yes, you can. Dyslexia can and does exist in all languages. It's a brain-based disorder. So that is a myth. Some people have heard, I've heard from families that thought, oh, well, I thought this only affects English speakers. And a student can be multilingual and have dyslexia as well.
Thank you. That was very clear. I appreciate that. Could you take a second to tell us a little bit about, not in terms of identification, but just in terms of what might be some additional challenges that you might experience if you are both an emergent bilingual and somebody who is struggling with dyslexia? How does that kind of complicate things for that student?
Well, it's awful. First of all, the delay, right? So even when we talk about, and I hate this model of wait to fail, before we intervene. But when you think about how we wait to fail with our English speaking students, when you're multilingual, that delay. So maybe I've seen in high school where we finally get, and usually it's actually a speech language pathologist who says, let's do some probing here. And that's because sometimes we feel like, and maybe we'll get into this later, there's going to be a false positive, or English screeners don't apply, or they won't work or give us a good result. But what I see is the delay. And it has such a huge impact when we think about vocabulary. And so we see these students who have a much more limited vocabulary, which leads to struggles with comprehension, which leads to a lot of times we see them just disengage, right? They disengage. And so even at the high school level, when I'm speaking to some teachers, I'll say, look, if you're doing a reading activity, are they interested, or they have a research project? Look at the students who tend to go towards pictures or videos or avoid text. That may be an indication that we need to do some more investigation there.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. One thing that I always think about when I think about students with dyslexia and learning another language is that dyslexia at its core is a phonological processing issue for a lot of students, not for all, but for most students. And when you're learning a language, you have to be able to tune into the sounds of that language in order to really become fluent just in speaking that language. So is it the case that if you are dyslexic that also you're learning English, say, or any other language than the first language that you spoke in the home, does it also make just becoming fluent with the oral language, does it also pose difficulties in that way?
So I think in some ways it can. I think with multilingual learners, and my experience and my expertise is with Spanish speaking, native Spanish speakers in a dual language setting, it actually can be a little bit easier to notice these things because Spanish is such a transparent language. So if we're looking at younger learners, first grade, second grade, where we're starting in our model, most of their literacy instruction is in Spanish. But you only have 5 vowel sounds, right? So if we're noticing students who are having difficulty mapping those sounds, matching those sounds to those letters, those graphemes, like we actually, if we're attending to and paying attention to what those young learners are doing, we can intervene earlier. And actually, I believe it's easier to intervene in Spanish and then have them pull those skills into English.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and of course it requires a lot of teacher knowledge and expertise, doesn't it, to do that effectively? Yeah, well, we'll talk a little bit more here about identification, but I do want to come over to you, Melina, and share a little bit about, of course, there's also overlap between dyslexia and bidialectal learners. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, again, it's a lot of this is around identification too, but just in terms of the impacts of dyslexia on a bidialectal speaker, or the impacts of being bidialectal on also being dyslexic, like how do those kind of overlap and affect each other in terms of just a student's experience at school?
Well, I mean, you're going to see a lot of what you would see with a multilingual learner in some aspects. In others, there's so many dialects. I think we focus primarily on African American English because it's, that's what we see in the schools. But Southern dialects are also impacted by different sounds, especially the phonological makeup of the dialect. And of course, you have like Hispanic influenced dialects, which are the same way. So when we're thinking about that, almost every kid that we work with in a school is speaking some kind of dialect. And these kids are often over-identified and under-identified at the same time. So, it's a real problem in the school systems because we find the kids that are affected by just a dialect, and we are identifying them as special ed students or needing intervention. And then at the same time, because we don't understand the dialect and we don't understand what the dialect does to reading, we are also kind of shying away from identifying those kids that need support because they have dyslexia. So it intersects in almost every area of reading. Their dialect, whatever dialect it is, impacts almost every aspect, from language to sounds to phonology to phonemic awareness. All of it is impacted by a dialect.
I'm really glad you said that about like Southern accents too, because here, at least where I am in Central Illinois, I have some teachers who their use of especially vowel sounds does not match the vowel sounds of their students. Mm-hmm. And I see the way that can impact their learning from each other. And when you mentioned that, it just kind of reminded me that it's important to remember that when we're talking about dialect, we're not just talking about African American English, that there's a lot of impacts of a lot of different kinds of dialect that might be a little bit less obvious, but are still really, really there.
Sure. And dialect is so closely related and tied to culture that I think it's very easy to kind of, your mind goes when you talk to dialect automatically to African American English. And that is, it's a huge dialect spoken in the schools. Mm-hmm. And almost every child who is African American does on some spectrum speak a form of African American English. So mm-hmm. you are going to deal with it in a school system, pretty much whatever school system you're in. But every dialect has those differences that affect the phonology, like you were talking about. A sound doesn't rhyme if you're making that sound different than your teacher. All of a
Yeah.
sudden, 2 words don't rhyme.
Totally.
It's really important to keep those things in mind, because when teachers hear that, or they see that this kid isn't making a connection between these 2 words rhyming, if
Totally.
they don't understand the culture and the dialect, that can very easily become something of, oh, well, they can't rhyme, so
Right.
they might have dyslexia. They
Right.
might need special ed services. And then, you get caught up in a system where what they're getting isn't what they actually need. And it's very easy for that to happen. Another thing that you see happen, and there's a lot of things that play a part in this. A lot of people who have dialects tend to be Black or Brown students.
Mhm.
So it's impacted by race.
Mhm.
But you also see people shy away from identifying kids who might have dyslexia because they're not comfortable with the culture, they're not comfortable with the dialect. So they see these kids struggling, and they've either got misconceptions about the students or the dialect, or they just don't understand it. So they just don't want to, they're just going to ignore it. And then that leads to kids being underrepresented.
And you bring up a very interesting point in terms of teacher knowledge, because the teacher's providing the model, if you will, and the various dialects regionally, culturally, teachers need to be aware of all of those issues so that they recognize their own model and their own recognition of how they're presenting sound combinations to the
And
student.
how they can explicitly teach those students and help them, while also maintaining the fact that how they speak is a part of, it's so closely tied to a part of their culture, and it does need to be celebrated, but also teach them ways in that they can understand those sounds and understand how in a general English dialect those 2 words would rhyme. And making those connections for those kids, but also at the same time celebrating it, because if you don't understand the culture and you don't understand the dialect, oftentimes what happens is you are correcting a kid, and even if you are not explicitly saying it, you are saying the way you're doing it is wrong. So you have to be very sensitive to about that, and you have to, which requires you to really know and understand those
Yes.
dialects.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much. So let's talk a little bit about identification. I feel like we're kind of getting in that direction, and it's a really big topic. I wanted to actually start with you, Janine, if that's okay, because as a parent and as an advocate, I know you've had a lot of experience working with families who are going through the process of figuring out whether their child might be dyslexic. And in the handbook, chapter 4 primarily focuses on school-based identification and systems of support for students with dyslexia. So Janine, if you're comfortable, could you kind of explain to our audience what the process in schools sort of should be for identifying students with dyslexia, at least in as much as you're comfortable kind of as it's laid out in the handbook? And I know that's a really big question. So panelists, if you want to jump in and help out Janine, please feel free.
So I'm just going to admit right here, I have never worked in a school. I was the phonics mom for 2 years in dual language kindergarten, and I used this awesome Reading Rockets program to teach the alphabetic principle. And I did it with for 2 years for volunteer work, and that was kind of like 3 years into my journey. So that's the amount of time I've spent in a school, and then COVID happened. So, but anyway, jump in if I don't have this exactly right. I think that I just want to start off by saying that in my district, the identification and just saying the word dyslexia is like a 180. All of the schools, from the administrative, like even down to the parents. So there's that stigma. But if as the parent, if your child, I always say, isn't taking flight in reading, so you're I'm not even going to put a grade attached to it, but the more grades out, the older the child is, if they need you to read every piece of homework to them and they're really struggling, it's really time to formally request some type of evaluation. And a lot of people, this is where parents just stumble because they've been in parent-teacher conferences. Maybe they've done everything right, reading to the child when it was in the womb or something. And they just never even thought dyslexia is not on the radar, right? But if you have it in your family, we do know it's hereditary. If your child's not able to take flight in reading, if there's spelling errors, if they're getting red flagged in the universal screener. So they're supposed to be screened three times a year. And there's a score that comes back. And, if your child is consistently in the bottom, I would say 25th percentile, and they're not qualifying for a push in or a pull out or anything. And this is where I've heard the most common, that your child's going to be fine, but in your gut that they can't read a 3-letter word to you. They can't sound those things out. There's a process of requesting an evaluation in writing. So you have to put that in writing. And that was something I didn't know you had to do. And then there's a turnaround time. It's very specific. I believe it's 14 days for the school. In my district, it's 14 days for them to business days for them to get back to you in writing on if they want to set a meeting. And then from there on, if you get lucky with the data and the team and the people that you met with, you need to go in there with maybe some test scores, because if you're meeting with a 3rd grade teacher, they might not know the history of Johnny and what he's been struggling with. You can take in birthday cards. I always took in grocery lists, had my children writing grocery lists. And so you need to prepare for that. And then if through the system, you can ask them if they have a dyslexia screener. In my school district, we have something called the dyslexia screener, and it screens for those 5 areas. And so we've made great progress here where parents are asking for the screener, and the classroom teacher is able to administer that within a half an hour, 20 minutes. And then if there's any, based on the results, you'll have that much more data. And we're finding here that it's like 1 out of 5 kids, the parents are asking for that screener. They're being given that screener, and then they're having the next meeting. And then down the road, they're gonna, if your child qualifies to be for an evaluation, then they might just do an academic evaluation. They might do academic and behavior evaluation. And that's done with the school psychologist is going to do that testing. Sometimes parents do the testing on their own outside of school, and then they'll want to bring that in. I would really advise you to go the school route first and save yourself a lot of money. And from my experience, that the testing is it's very similar. In my school district, it was almost identical. And then they'll open, if they qualify based on that testing, and also all of the teacher feedback that they're going to get from the classroom feedback. And in my case, they really took in a lot of parent feedback because I just had so much data myself. And I had a tutor, maybe you're working with a tutor already. And then that whole process, if you actually qualify for an independent educational plan, an IEP or a 504, it can take a school year to put that in place. So when you get that feeling inside, it's time to write the letter and get it going, because it takes a long time. So you guys want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in just for a second, because I think it's so interesting and valuable for those of us who have worked in schools to hear that parent perspective of what it feels like as a parent. Because I feel like what I'm hearing from you, Janine, is like, this is kind of what it looks like from the outside. You know what I mean? And those of us who work in schools, there's all these systems and acronyms and stuff that we kind of like, terms that we throw around. And I think it's really important to remember that, like, for parents, like that, a lot of that doesn't really, it's very opaque. So
Yeah,
let's
and
now,
I think the toolkit, the actual glossary and all of the educational vocabulary that's specific to dyslexia and trying to get intervention or a domain meeting or, you know,
right,
I didn't know what that was, all foreign. And I just live in a district where they were putting on a parent seminar to come and learn about this process. And this is the facilitator and this is what this person does. And once I understood what all that was, I'm like, oh, these are just everybody's rules for the meeting.
right.
But it was so foreign that I think that is very intimidating for parents, and they that's why they start to like get really nervous. And
Yeah,
they honestly, it's so foreign. So I would use this toolkit to reference any of the terminologies. Like earlier, I think it was Kim mentioned phoneme or grapheme. Like nobody, lot of everybody doesn't know what that means out there. Phonemic awareness, you know, they don't know. That's a deficit that might pop up in the screener. What is decoding? What is encoding? I mean, that's your lingo, teachers, but you know, that is not the parents' lingo. So this handbook would have really saved a lot of, you know, kind of frustration for parent perspective. So I think it's very valuable for all the glossary definitions and everything.
So parents who are on this call know that this handbook can really be a tool for you to kind of decode, if you will, some of the school systems that are in place to support your students, but maybe don't always actually feel that way, I think, at times. But let's flip it, and I don't know which one of you wants to take this, but one of you who have been part of that process on the school, and Melina or Kellen or Kim, tell us a little bit about how a student moves from being in just a general education student to being a student who is perhaps labeled as dyslexic, perhaps not, but has you know, special education services for reading. What does that process, what should that process look like according to the handbook, I guess?
Well, there's a couple ways that a kid can get from, you know, just a gen ed student to either a student with an IEP or a student that is identified as having a reading disability. I did notice in the question somebody had asked, and I just wanted to kind of answer it. Can you clarify what you mean when you say schools identifying the child with dyslexia? We don't call it dyslexia in public school systems. Typically, we label them as SLD with specific learning disabilities in reading. But whether we label it dyslexia or we label it SLD, the understanding is the same. This student has a reading deficit, and the process is going to look the same whether we call it dyslexia or SLD. So the terminology is a little different, and I think that again, you know, Janine is correct in that the words that we use are so confusing, I think, to parents. It's super important to make sure that during this IEP process that we are really breaking these words down and these terminologies down. I also think it's important that we say the word dyslexia in IEP meetings. I often do. You know, I am qualified to test for dyslexia, SLD, whatever you want to call it. I am qualified to do that as an SLP, and I do that. I'm part of the team when a parent makes a request or when a teacher highlights any concerns. I'm part of that team that goes in and does testing and evaluations. And whether or not we qualify a kid for SLD, I will say to the parents, you know, this looks like dyslexia. What I'm seeing looks like dyslexia. If you want that diagnosis, if it's important to you to have that terminology, that label, you know, I recommend seeing a doctor, following up with you know, your primary caregiver. I recommend that if you want that label. If you're okay with us treating it like it's dyslexia and treating it in the school, we can do that. You know, we don't need that diagnosis of dyslexia in order to treat something that is dyslexia. So it's just a different wording and terminology, but it is the same thing.
And my concern is like Janine was saying, these kids get lost in between systems, in between terminology. Dyslexia has been part of IDEA under specific learning disability, as you said. But there's also a letter in the toolkit. It's from the Office of Special Ed, and it's in response to educators, psychologists, social workers asking about the use of the word dyslexia. And if dyslexia identifies that student, it is educational under specific learning disability, but it also points out the need for the specific explicit instruction and intervention that we'll talk about. So yeah, that has been a myth, and that's been a source of disagreement, if you will, for years and years and years. But if educators look at their IEPs, and no matter what system they use, be it an Illinois PDF or Embrace IEP, it has the word dyslexia under specific learning disability. So why would we not use a term that is in the paperwork, that has been a part of the law? So it's a problem. And yes, we can talk labels all day, but it's the kids that get lost between this.
I think the most damaging thing, and I see this with parents that I work with, is their kid has dyslexia and they don't know that. And so they don't access places like the International Dyslexia Association and there's like so many resources out there that if you just understand this is actually what's going on with my child, you can access Decoding Dyslexia, there's a wealth of resources, but if you don't use the word, a lot of parents don't know that that's what you're talking about, and they're really missing out on opportunities to support their kids, I think.
And one quick thing, it's important for the kids. They know from kindergarten on they're struggling. It's important for them to know, and for those of us that work with, third through junior high and high school that I spent years, it's important for the kid to know. So.
And I also think it's important to emphasize that not all students with dyslexia are going to necessarily qualify for an IEP because it does exist on a continuum. And so this is one of the soapboxes that I will get on, that dyslexia is a tier 1 issue, that all teachers need to be trained in how to support students with dyslexia. And coming from, I mean, I am a gen ed teacher myself and had no idea until Melina, thankfully, taught me about this, that I was able to say, oh, wow. Yes, I have 8th graders sitting in front of me that cannot access the text that is in front of them. I need to intervene in some way, even though I am just a gen ed teacher. I have a responsibility. I have the moral imperative to help support these students. And so, again, regardless of the label or whatever, this is a tier 1 issue, because if you see a student that is struggling and they have these red flags, these, deficit areas, then yes, it is our job as educators to intervene. If you're a gen ed, special ed, interventionist, whatever you might be, again, it's our moral imperative to do that.
I just want to echo what Kellen said. We're aligned. And I would also add that for teachers, you often find yourself in this, I don't want to use the word awkward, but there's a tension there, right? So there's pressure, something is not quite right. My strategy has been to gather data and gather more data. That can be audio data, that can be visual data. How are they segmenting? Even asking parents, going back to what Janine was saying, like the parent has this sense that something is not quite right. A simple question a parent can ask: what sound does this letter make? In a word. And if they're having trouble with that might be an indication they need to speak with the teacher and see if the teacher is seeing anything. But I think what teachers do, because we haven't built that professional knowledge yet, so I'm hoping our state will help with that. But to gather data, and maybe we'll talk about that later, but ways in which you can gather data so that then you can go to your school psychologist, you can go to your SLP, and you can say, hey, this is what I've gathered. Can we take a look at it? I know I've personally been discouraged from suggesting parents should write letters, right? Because that's sort of the way to to start the clock. But I think as an educational professional in the school setting, there are still ways you can advocate if you know your student needs additional support. The first line of defense, and I always believe, interventions can be delivered in the classroom. Right, but we have to build that time in. First of all, we have to build that time to be able to work with those small groups or even one-on-one. And then teachers have to know what to do. What are some strategies I can use? What's a protocol? What's a scope and sequence I could, well, if we're talking about systematic instruct, where do I start? So I think those are some things. I think we need to empower our teachers to advocate for students, just like parents have a sense that something is not quite right, teachers do too.
Yeah, 100%. Those are all really, really great points. And I feel like we could probably just sit here talking about identification for the rest of the evening. But I would like to move us into a little bit about actual instruction, because that is a big piece of the handbook, and also a big part of the goal, I think, of the document. So let's kind of move into, and it's a nice segue, actually, Kim, that you provided there. So let's talk a little bit about what the handbook says about instructional strategies for these students. And Kellen, I think you may have spent a good chunk of time working on that section of the handbook. So maybe you could, it's primarily aimed at school personnel, I think, chapter 6. So could you kind of tell the audience just a little bit of what will they find in that section of the plan? What kind of instructional strategies, in other words, are most appropriate when working with?
Yeah, sure. So first and foremost, I think it's important to note that like I said previously, like the students with dyslexia are the issue of all teachers, not just special education teachers, not just reading interventionists, literacy specialists, SLPs, what have you. And so within chapter 6, as it stands right now, but it's being revised as we speak, actually, we talk a lot about structured literacy. And so what structured literacy is, and how it is explicit, systematic, cumulative, and how we should leave no room to guess for our students that struggle with those foundational literacy skills, such as phoneme, grapheme, or letter sound correspondences. And additionally, we also call out practices that are not aligned with the evidence base, such as the 3 cueing system, and just leaving room to guess. Which is what I was trained in as an undergrad and grad student in teaching reading. And so we talk a lot about theory throughout chapter 6, and we do give examples in regard to each component of structured literacy and what that might look like. However, here's a little tidbit of information for the next iteration. We're actually splitting up chapter 6, and we're doing more of a theory, and then chapter 7, fun fact, we're adding another chapter to really go into practice and what this looks like in the classroom. So yeah, cool. We talk about structured literacy. What does that actually look like? And how can a classroom teacher use this information? How can an interventionist or whoever you might be, how can you actually use this information in the classroom? And so within chapter 6, again, as it stands right now, we talk a lot about what this is and some resources that you can use to learn more about structured literacy and how to use this in the classroom. But essentially it comes down to just good instruction for not only students with dyslexia, but for all students, to ensure that all students have the access to learn how to read, regardless if they have that official diagnosis, if they have an IEP, a 504, whoever they might be, just that really good foundational core instruction for learning how to read, which again, I mean, that's our moral imperative as teachers. And so really just goes into the different components of structured literacy within chapter 6 as it stands right now. But like I said, stay tuned.
Yeah.
Chapter
Stay tuned
7
for chapter 7. That's
is
exciting.
coming.
And this might be a good moment for you to also put in a little bit of a plug for what's in the toolkit, which is a totally separate document. And we haven't really talked about it very much, but I think there's a lot in the toolkit am I right, related to instruction?
Yeah. So as it stands as of
Yeah.
today. Chapter 6 talks, like I said, about theory, but then the toolkit. So the toolkit is really nice because it gives a plethora of resources. So whether it be a website, like Florida Center for Reading Research or Reading Universe or Reading Rockets, or like there are so many resources. And for me personally, as a teacher, that's hard for me to keep track of all of those resources unless I have 20 billion tabs on my computer, which I do. However, for other teachers out there, it's nice to have all of the resources within one place. And so you can go to, if you want to look for specific lesson plans or websites or what have you, there's a tab for that. If you are interested in listening to a podcast, there's a tab for that. Videos, if you want to buy a book or get a book from the library, there is a tab for that. So if you want to take the next step in learning more about dyslexia or structured literacy, or just honestly best practices in teaching reading, you can kind of explore the toolkit, and you can honestly go down a rabbit hole and just spend your entire week exploring the resources in that. But I will say it's really nice because it aligns with each chapter of the handbook. And so nobody, well, except for maybe like the people on this call probably are going to sit down and read the handbook from front to back. But for, a teacher in a classroom that is just trying to get by and just trying to like get the best information that they can, they go to chapter 6. Awesome. They like pick out whatever they want to read, but then go to the toolkit, click chapter 6, and then there it is. You can pick a website. You can pick another cool part. Just thought about this. Another cool part of the toolkit is that there are some free assessments on there too. So let's say that your school does not have an early literacy screener. Okay, no big deal, because you can, well, it is a big deal, but no big deal for you because you can click on the assessment tab and you can find free early literacy screeners or other different types of screeners on there. And so you can like print those off and do those if you have a student in which you're concerned about. And so you can get that information right there, which is really, really nice. And then there's also some free curriculum that is also listed on there, but then also there are some different other curriculum on there that if you're interested in outside training too, boom, there you go.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
One-stop shop-ish.
Yeah. That's fantastic. And I saw there were some questions in the chat and Q&A about assessment. So hopefully that will help some folks that had questions about that and screeners. And screeners, of course, is a whole other big topic that we probably won't get to tonight, but maybe if we have a little bit of time at the end, we can circle back to that. I did want to ask Melina and Kim to talk a little bit about instruction and identification, if you have time, for students who are dyslexic and multilingual or dyslexic and bidialectic, because there are special considerations, I think, for both of those populations when they also have dyslexia. So Melina, would you want to start and talk a little bit about instruction for students who are dyslexic and bidialectal?
Well, I'm really excited to kind of get into this book. The chapters that cover bidialectical students in the handbook are great. There's a great framework there. I think the part that I'm most excited about is really fleshing out that framework. I want to add more about exact structures or strategies for teaching and for tier 1 support for students who are bidialectical and have any sort of reading difficulties. So I'm excited to kind of get in there and talk about that and give some real good evidence-based strategies for teaching and working with tier 1 on the tier 1 level with those students. Another thing is also the testing, because it's tricky. I think it's something that a lot of people are very uncomfortable doing because there aren't a lot of great assessments that come in a box that you can just pull out and assess a bidialectical student and determine whether or not they have dyslexia or whether or not they have a language disorder. It's pieces of a lot of different things, and it's also understanding, again, the history and the structure of that dialect. You have to have a lot of your own knowledge. You have to have a lot of experience and research to really understand what you're looking at, because there isn't just a great pamphlet that says, here are the differences for Southern dialect, and here's the box that you use to test. So it's intimidating, I think, for even a lot of professionals. So I'm really excited to kind of talk about that and talk about, dynamic assessments that you can do and parts of different tests that you can use to kind of get a picture of the whole child. But it is trickier than just looking at a student saying, you speak general American English, let's sit down and I'm going to give you this test. And once I have a number, I'll know if you're dyslexic or not.
Right.
It's different. It is more experience. You need more experience, and you need to have more research and understanding of what you're doing, I think. So I'm really excited to kind of put that into the book and really talk about that.
That's great. Yeah, I'm so glad that you're going to be a part of that process. And as you're talking, it makes me think too about the classroom teacher who isn't diving into big full assessments, but is probably administering screeners, or at least we hope. And considerations. I know that there are specific, and I think Julie Washington has talked some about this, about sort of specific phoneme patterns in different dialects and how those could appear to be a phonological processing error, but maybe they're just more attributable to dialect and that kind of thing. And it'd be great if some of that information could get included in the handbook. I think some of it is there too, but I feel like that could be a very good resource for classroom teachers.
Yeah, I'm like I said, the handbook has a great framework for all of that. I think, there could be like more, it could be fleshed out a little bit more, especially with the exact teaching strategies and what you need to keep in mind when you're teaching, and also kind of addressing that issue of code switching, and really talking about that, talking about what it means and addressing it head on. Do we do it? Do we not do it? If we're going to do it, how do we do it? Because again, I've talked to so many teachers who say, I don't want to touch that. I just don't want to touch it, and I don't want to discourage a kid from speaking the way they speak. I don't want to tell them what they're doing is wrong. I just don't want to touch it. So I think if we have a good framework for that, it makes it less scary.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for that, Melina. And Kim, switching over to you for just a second, talking about instruction for students who are multilingual learners and dyslexic. And I know that there's real issues just even identifying those students, as you were talking about earlier in the evening. But let's say you do have a student like that in your classroom. What does the handbook kind of talk about how to support them, how best to support them instructionally?
Well, so I think one of those things, because we know that phonological skills are super important. So that's really where, as a classroom teacher, I would hone in. So you're looking at like phoneme discrimination, right? Those blending skills, those segmentation skills. And what's paid off for me a lot was word work and spelling, right? That really moved students so much. And we tend to, I think, due to some other literacy programs that were very popular, we got away from spelling, right? It's such an important skill and it's such an important tool that can help students even with comprehension, with writing. So that's where I would start. And so even in 5th grade, I was teaching those skills, phonemic awareness. There are programs out there in English and in Spanish that you can use to really get at that phonemic awareness. They may not, there's some discussion as to whether they're appropriate, but I think if you know what you're using a tool for, it's a tool. So if I know I just want to address this one thing, which is phonemic awareness, and this tool is helpful in me doing that, then I'm going to use that tool. Blending, again, so there's a lot of information there. Segmenting, you segment in different languages as well, right? Different languages have syllables. So all of these skills, there is some transfer. And so that's where I would begin. We have to know that those phonology networks, there's some overlap between first and second languages and even multiple languages. So some of those things, phonological awareness, building fluency. I did use I'll name the tool Heggerty for a specific thing, and it's offered in English and Spanish. And it worked for what I needed it to work for, and to see students progressing towards grade level proficiency.
I feel like a theme that I'm really hearing from all of you is how important teacher knowledge is. And I love that theme because that's what we're all about at the Reading League. But I think that also the handbook is really trying to contribute to that as well. Like that, you know, really building teacher knowledge. And when I say teacher, I really mean, you know, anybody who's involved in educating a student. A parent can be a teacher, an administrator can be a teacher, but people who are involved in education need to have the knowledge that they can then apply to support their students. And I feel like that's really what I'm hearing from everybody on the call. Lindy, before we move on, I'm just wondering if there are any questions. I know some of our panelists have actually been, you guys are very good at multitasking. I'm impressed. I have not been put a single thing in the chat. But Lindy, are there any questions that have come up that we haven't really had a chance to address yet?
Yeah, people have been really, really good about answering. So thank you, panelists, for doing that. Louise has also posted some answers too, in response to several people wanting to know about dyslexia and mandates. And she did refer, you know, people to the IDEA and the United States Department of Education, MTSS system. So all of those are, you know, schools are required to assess if a parent request is, I think is what she was getting at. Melina, there was a question directed to you about the TILs. If a student has been through MTSS, you know, the MTSS system, and there's a concern of dyslexia, what other, excuse me, what other assessments would you partner with the TILs?
I mean, it really depends on the student. It depends on what the concern is. I have about 500 different evaluations. You know, if I'm looking at it being more of a language concern, I might give a kid something like the SELF or the CASTLE. So the SELF looks at language use, expressive and receptive language understanding. So I might look at something like that. If we have a concern about, you know, reading deficits and vocabulary, I might look at something like the PPVT, which is the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, to see how their receptive knowledge of vocabulary is, classroom tier 2 vocabulary. It really depends on, you know, not just the reading deficit or the decoding deficit, but dyslexia also incorporates language. There are also language deficits in dyslexia. So what exactly is the language deficit? Is it a syntax deficit? Is it a morphology deficit? You know, is it just a phonemic deficit and it's just sound letter correspondence? What is the whole concern? I might pull something in and do a RAND test if I'm concerned about processing, which the TILS has a RAND portion in it, which is why I love the TILS, because you can do, there's about 60 different subtests in the TILS and you can do whatever your concern is. So you don't have to give like a whole 2-hour TILS test, which is great. But if you need to, you can. So that's why some portion usually always has a part of the TILS, whatever evaluation I'm doing, if it's for reading, but then there's 100 other things I can do beyond that.
Thank you. And then there were a couple other questions. I feel like most of them have been answered, but there was a way back at the beginning, there was a specific question about dyslexia simulator. And Tom had answered that question about ERI, and the SLD project offer dyslexia simulations in person. And then Kellen, is that the SLD project, is that one also offered virtually?
So we don't do it virtually. However, so our simulation is a little bit different. We don't just do a dyslexia simulation. We do dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia, and that is an in-person simulation. And so if interested, feel free to go to www.sldsupports.org and reach out to your regional specialist.
I'm seeing a question in the chat that I think, or maybe a little bit of a conversation that I think gets to a really profound, perhaps, area of confusion. And I know on some other calls that I've been on, I'm not sure that anybody really fully grasps the answer to this question. But if a parent requests an evaluation, is the school required to do that evaluation? And I believe the answer is no.
The school's
But-
required to consider the
Right.
request.
Right. And I think I was looking at that section in the handbook, and I think, Kellen, take a note. I feel like that that section of the handbook could be clarified, because I think there's a lot of confusion around that. Like, well, because of course there's also child find, which is a law that requires that a district look for students with disabilities. And so there's this kind of tension, I think, between, I suspect a disability, but you're telling me that this doesn't warrant an evaluation.
I think in reality, most of the time, because schools don't want to look like they are preemptively ignoring a parent's concerns, most of the time, an evaluation will be done if a parent asks for it. However, I have been part of evaluation teams where a parent has asked and we have denied. We are required to provide in writing exactly why we are not going to be doing an evaluation. So in that case, we'd be looking at benchmarking scores, we'd be looking at grades, we'd be looking at a number of things and saying, here is why your child doesn't need an evaluation at this time. So I mean, but again, overall, I mean, from my experience working in several different school districts, overall, if there's a concern there, we want to look like we're addressing it.
And this is where it goes back to the whole nuanced situation where not all students with dyslexia will necessarily qualify for the IEP, which is why our general education teachers should be informed and be knowledgeable about supporting students with dyslexia in the general education classroom.
Absolutely, because there is that myth that dyslexia is a special education problem, right? And so I don't need to worry about it because I don't have those students. They're going to handle them down there in the resource room. And that's 100%. You're going to have, like you've said before, Kellen, you will have students with dyslexia in your classroom every single year as a classroom teacher.
And I've seen over the years some kids getting lost in that as well, and that's true exactly what you said, Kellen. I think it's an important piece, as everybody's been talking about. So we've been talking about teacher knowledge. One of the section in the resource area of the handbook that I worked on that I really wanted was that bi-directional aspect of the knowledge of a speech pathologist, a psychologist, an early intervention profile, understanding that in relation to the development of and the growth of reading and writing skills, just as you said, in terms of the spelling. To tell you, there's never been, in the course of my career, we didn't forget spelling. It's never been there. So anyway, but for those professionals, and I'll speak for speech pathologists, we're looking at the processing of this and that. And okay, and if they qualify for that processing, or if they're weak at it and they won't qualify for an IEP, we still should share the impact of that skill in the area of reading and writing. And that may be for a tier 2 or, however the district has that plotted out. But instead of focusing on you get my services or you don't get my services, we need to look at what are those skills, how were those skills transferred and impacted within the gen ed curriculum. And just one other real important piece, many districts and districts in which I retired from don't look at the specific skills. So they don't have enough of that knowledge of segmenting and blending or decoding to be able to make an appropriate recommendation of testing or not testing, because they've never really torn apart the onion to see the pieces that are impacted on reading.
I like that. Peel apart the onion to see the pieces. It's so true. Well, and even, I mean, talking with educators across the state in regard to data literacy too, talking about how to really analyze the data that we do have. Is it the data that we need to inform our instruction? I mean, that's a whole another conversation, but hopefully something that we will be able to support in the future with the handbook.
Yeah, what is that saying? I think it's Stephanie Stoller that says, weighing the hog does not make it fatter. Is that what it is? Where it's like, just because you measured something doesn't necessarily mean that it's giving you the information that you need. I love that metaphor.
Or your IEP goal says you're going to measure the hog every, X number of weeks with no idea of whether you're going to fatten that hog or not. And that too often happens.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, we are actually getting close to the end of our time. We've got about 10 minutes left here, and we haven't actually even talked about the third purpose. Well, we've touched on it, but the third purpose of the handbook is to provide a description of resources and services available to students with dyslexia and their families. So we have talked some about resources, but chapter 5 is really primarily for caregivers. So Janine, if you want to talk about this, or other folks chime in too, but what are some important resources and services that dyslexic students and their caregivers really should be aware of? And I think actually some of this you put in the chat a little bit as well.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, parents, you are the greatest advocate. Trust your gut. You know your child's strengths. There's a reason why they're bringing that up in school all the time. So hold on to those closely. I spoke about the educational vocabulary, but really the power of connection and organization. So in the handbook, it's going to give you a plethora of videos, right? And sit down with your kid, depending on how old they are, and you can watch some of those videos. Our organization has this great 5-minute video. There's several listed in the handbook. There's a list of Illinois organizations that you need to get connected with through all the social media platforms, or the one social media platform that you can handle. And those are Everyone Reading Illinois. They are going to supply parent conferences. I have been to their spring conferences and their educator conferences. And if this becomes a passion project for you, like it was for me, I mean, you will just be, I cannot tell you the number of I'm going to make a poster of the national researchers who've come to, DuPage County in a year and 2 years time. It's absolutely amazing what these organizations are doing. Children's Dyslexia Center, Redwood Literacy, Decoding Dyslexia, my group, Dyslexia Action Group in Naperville, which is a parent group. You definitely need to know the International Dyslexia Association, and the Reading League. And the Reading League primarily is focused on educators, but I have learned so much about everything that from curriculum, and it's a really polished what they're doing, and it's a outstanding resource that's available. The best book I could recommend is Overcoming Dyslexia. You can get it at your public library. You can get on Amazon and have it delivered in 2 days, right? There's some great podcasts out there. It's depending on what you have time for on your commute or whatever. So this handbook has those resources listed in there. And I would just say, also, it doesn't have a list of all the parents in your community. So go on those like Facebook groups, go to your school board meetings, find out who your special, your superintendent of student services is, and don't be afraid to call and ask questions. Like, I have a great rapport with our superintendent of assessment. There's a lot of people in administration, and they don't get that many calls. So if you're curious about the assessment and how it works, like I've gone in and had a tour of it. So I would just say, find the parents on your street, on your neighborhood. It's okay to talk about these things, because as soon as you do, you guys will start sharing resources, and you really help your child, and you'll be able to understand, because it's all the way through high school. My daughter just took the SAT. She's a junior. We're looking at colleges, and it's with them forever. So good luck, everybody. It's going to be fine.
Thank you, Janine. Do any of our other panelists want to add to any of that, to that list of resources? That, of course, the toolkit is a big resource as well, and hopefully the handbook Is there anything else that Janine, you listed a ton of stuff. That was really great. And one of our questions was if we're going to list those out, and we will.
They're in the handbook. There's this
Yeah.
section, the last section of the handbook. If you click on that little the link to the handbook is for families, and you can click around, like Kellen was saying earlier, you can go down the rabbit hole. But the video section, you know, I would encourage you to connect with that. And whether you're just learning about it now or you're an educator, this is like, my group invites the experts and then we share that content. So that's what this handbook and this toolkit is. It's really, really valuable.
I want to add one other resource that I don't think you mentioned, but just to put a pitch out for it, which is Callan's group, the SLD Support Project, also has tons and tons of free resources available beyond just the handbook and the toolkit, including PD and conferences and all. I mean, Callan, you could do that spiel. I'm stealing your thunder here, but there's the SLD Support Project, which is new. You guys have only really been around for about a year now. Has a ton of support for educators, but also for parents. Is that true? For caregivers?
Yeah, so we have an annual conference every year, which has been 2 years now, but really 1 year with everybody on the team. Our first conference was virtual, but this past year was our first in-person conference, which was in Effingham, Illinois, which is exciting because it's Central Illinois. So people from Central Southern Illinois got to come, and we had a parent panel, which was, I wasn't there. I was in another room, but I heard it was absolutely phenomenal. And so providing resources and connections for families as well. We've had a couple of PDs specifically in regard to executive functioning and other things that were geared towards parents. But I mean, parents can get on our website and do our on-demand, absolutely free, no cost professional development, and can watch videos. If you are a teacher and need those PDHs, you can get those also on the on-demand webinars. But then also, like I said previously, each area within Illinois has a regional specialist, and you can connect with them. And we tour the state of Illinois. And so we are constantly in every single region from, like I said, the most northern part of Illinois to the most southernmost part of Illinois. And this summer, we actually have 2 symposia, one in Harrisburg, Illinois, which is my hometown with Marion Wolf, and then one in Rockford. And so we constantly just try to make the information accessible to educators. That's the first step, right? Just getting the information out, getting people excited to learn more about it, and then kind of following through with that. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so
I
much.
would just like to add, it's not in the handbook, but they are referenced in the handbook, and that's a classroom teacher. Even though some of our teachers may not have the professional expertise yet to deliver interventions, there's still an important resource, because that conversation that says, my student is struggling, what will you do? What support is available? Then sort of puts the ball in the school's court. And I do feel like I hear from a lot of parents that are just leapfrogging, saying, I'm not getting help here, so I'm going here. I'm hiring a private tutor. I'm in the case of one parent, I'm getting OG trained. And so she's paying this money out of her pocket to get trained to teach her child how to read when her child attends school. So there's something wrong with that. If anything, and this is how I got involved in this, actually, was a conversation with the parents. I said, I'm concerned that your child is struggling with reading. And she said, you know, each year they've told me they'll be fine. They'll be fine. You're the first person who said there's a problem here, and I feel like there's a problem. So what do we do? And I had to be honest. I was a new teacher, and I said, I'm not quite sure. Let me research and get back to you. And I knew one thing I could do was research. And that's how I found the Reading League. That's how I found resources to help me in my practice. So even if, as Kelly mentioned, a student is not identified as needing 504 and IEP, as practitioner and an instructor, I can say, well, I can support oral language development. Guess what? All of my lessons will begin with a discussion protocol that I'll use. And so we're going to be engaged in as a universal support. I only need it for 3 kids, but guess what? 25 other kids benefit. So there are some things I really want to encourage parents, go to that classroom teacher, go to the school and just ask what's available. What can you do?
I love that, Kim, because it also, as we've been talking about how important teacher knowledge is, and part of teacher knowledge is teachers knowing that they need to get that knowledge, right? And so if we don't tell them like, hey, my kid's struggling, if they're not hearing that, then I mean, a lot of teachers go out and seek this knowledge just on their own, but some of them need that little nudge to be like, there's a problem that I don't know how to solve it, so I need to go learn more. And I think you're absolutely right that we have to provide them those nudges, if you will, in order to motivate them to really go out and learn more, and can't expect them to just magically have all this knowledge, you know what I mean, that just kind of fell into their heads. That's not really the way it works. So I appreciate you saying that a lot. We are at time, so I'm going to take a second here to share my screen so that folks who are on the call and have hung in there with us till the very, very end can get their PD hours. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but I'm going to ask our panelists to just stay on with me for a couple more minutes here, if you don't mind, so that if we have any final questions, we can do that. So I'm trying to get this to go ahead, but it just really doesn't want to do that. There we go. Okay. So I do want to say thank you to our panelists very much for being here tonight. You guys have provided a ton of really great information and calls to action. So I really appreciate that, and your time and your expertise. There's a link here now on the screen if you want to get PD hours. You can just use that QR code if you want, but there is going to be it's going to ask you for a secret phrase, or I think it says phrase, but it might say word. But anyway, we're just going to use Handbook for that. So just take a second, write that down if you want to get your PD hours, and then you can follow that link to get those. And one more pitch also, if you have further questions that you feel like haven't been answered tonight, do think about coming to our coffee chat next Saturday. That is totally the wrong date. It is the 18th of May, not the 9th. Tonight's the 9th. So next Saturday, the 18th, we'll be talking with Louise, and she will, Louise is on the call, so I can say this, and she can't respond because she's in the audience. So Louise will have the answers to all of your questions next Saturday. So be sure to come along for that. It should be a lot of fun. So thank you all for coming, and I'm going to just ask Lindy, if you're still here, if there are any additional questions that you feel like we need to get to before we let our wonderful panelists go for the evening.
I think we have answered just about everything.
That's impressive.
Let me just peek one more time here. I know that there's a couple of questions that we could spend so much time on. Are there certain intervention programs that you all suggest to support students that are in tier 2, tier 3, and then how to have special educators assist with dyslexia? So, I mean, I know my response to that, but we could talk a long time, couldn't we?
We could talk a long time. And maybe the first answer to that is, and it's so exciting that we can say this now, is take a look at the handbook, because there are answers to those questions in the handbook. It's a wealth of information and knowledge, and deeply researched. And I mean, huge kudos to the team at the SLD support group, because it's a massive document with a ton of information just in the handbook. And then the toolkit also has so much great information and resources. So I think maybe we'll just close with that if you have further questions, dig into that handbook, dig into that toolkit, and join us next Saturday, and Louise will answer the rest of your questions. Poor Louise. She's going to kill me. But thank you, panelists, so much. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate all of you guys participating tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and say goodnight and stop our recording. Thank you all very, very much.